Uh,
There we go.
okay. So as now you know, I'm French and my laptop is actually parameterized in French. Uh, but otherwise, thanks for the invitation and the lovely introduction. Okay, apparently, yeah, I can still change slide. Um, so I thought I would just start with a bit of a personal introduction because I haven't met all of you yet. So I did my PhD in cultural evolution, but in a cognitive science department, and I guess my work is usually classified as part of the Paris School in cultural evolution for those who have those kind of like marks or habits about how cultural evolution is kind of parsed out as a field. And I've worked a bunch on naturally occurring data sets, so including coats of arms, artworks, and portraits in particular, and also writing systems and how complex letters are. I've also used a bit cultural transmission experiments and iterated learning, and that's kind of all things I've done mostly during my PhD. And I thought it would be probably more exciting for you to hear about stuff I haven't published yet. This is a project I'm hoping to get the preprint out in the next month or so. Um, yeah, so I'm really looking forward any kind of question or really please push back against this account if you can. Um, this is mostly about explaining how large-scale trade came about, because large-scale trade is a very kind of defining feature of the modern world, and it has also been part of humankind's history. So kind of how we expanded the reach of commercial exchanges. And if you're looking at the literature, you can think of either kind of global accounts that have been attempted or more localized case studies, but you hardly find very mechanistic explanations of it. And that's kind of where I want to go. So it's going to be a fairly straightforward way to present it, but the first thing is to kind of describe how trade expanded and what were the problems that were encountered during this expansion. Um, then the solution I want to propose is that you got some kind of cultural scaffolding of that kind of allowed trade to overcome those problems. And the last thing is just kind of discussing which type of support we can see for this. So starting with the expansion of trade and which kind of problems encountered, uh, you can have this kind of really rough picture of scale starting as pretty local with a limited geographic scope, occurring between individuals who knew each other and really occurring by exchanging only some specific types of goods. It's also taking place within established social relationships, and it's mostly synchronous, um, to something that is more globalized and kind of a description of contemporary world. So in this case, most commercial exchanges occur between individuals who don't know each other, and it basically involves pretty much all types of goods. It also occurs outside of established relationships, and it's mostly asynchronous. And those kind of three first aspects are kind of geographic type of expansion, demographic, and in terms of variety of goods exchanged. So there's a kind of typology you can make of problems encountered by trade when it expanded. And the first thing is you kind of need those necessary conditions in the first place to get commercial exchanges. So that includes producing surplus or actually having demand for the products you're producing. Within this circle of necessary conditions, you get another subset which relates to the uncertainty with which the exchange is actually going to be able to occur. So that involves, for instance, the fact that you have secured roads or property rights that are actually enforced, or also simply kind of logistics on how you move things from point to another. And finally, among all those reasons to be uncertain about the outcome of commercial exchanges are an even tinier subset of problems, which I call problems of trust. And it's really just the share of uncertainty that relates to the exchange partner's behavior. And that's the part we're going to really focus on. And it's something that is kind of often acknowledged, that you kind of get trade only if you have trust, and that the lack of trust is a problem for trade in general. So for instance, this is a cover from The Economist that appeared last year, and shows this pretty well. So kind of in more details, what were those obstacles and what are the things that kind of put weight on trust and made trust difficult? Um, there are at least 5 main kind of categories of things that have been identified. And I'm going to go through each one of them. So for instance, the thing is, you usually get kind of informational asymmetry when you're trying to get commercial exchanges between two parties who don't know each other off the ground. So informational asymmetry is this kind of lemons and peaches story that was coined in the 70s. So whenever sellers have more information on their goods than the buyers do, it can drive all the high quality goods or peaches out of the market in favor of low quality goods or lemons. You also get the fact that more and more of the commercial exchanges become asynchronous, which means that people have more opportunities for defection. There's another problem called the fundamental problem of exchange, which is that for individuals to enter mutually beneficial exchange relationships, they need to recognize them as such, and they have to be able to commit and to fulfill their contractual obligations. There's also a principal agent problem, which is a pretty classic one in economy. And that means that when a principal hires an agent to act on their behalf, the agent and the principal's interests might not be aligned. So if you're the principal and you're hiring an agent to conduct business on your behalf in a place where you cannot really control what they're going to do, they might decide to take more than their share, for instance. And finally, one last aspect is the kind of temporal horizon, because if you get those kind of more one-shot like things, there's less opportunities for strict reciprocity, more opportunities to defect, and kind of end of game effects. So I can see there's a message in the chat, but I cannot read it. So if there's any kind of interruptions, just please feel free to interrupt directly. And the idea among all those kind of problems is basically they can be kind of sorted out in 2 main categories. And one of them is that you get a lack of reliable information on the commercial exchange and its possible outcomes and the likelihood of these outcomes. And on the other side, you also just have cases where incentives are actually misaligned. So all agents just don't have the incentives being kind of strongly going in the direction of actually having trade with each other without trying to fool each other. And economic history, and I think to some extent cultural evolution too, have this kind of usual suspects and emphasis on how institutions actually played a role in solving this problem, because they're able to change the incentives and control the behavior of agents who are part of them, including by punishing them or enforcing some types of behaviors. But I think the role of those kind of full-blown institutions, that's like a really specific subset of institutions, tend to be maybe a bit overblown. And there's a few reasons for that. And the first thing is, usually they kind of appear after the relevant changes rather than before them. And for instance, the legislation on trademarks is pretty telling about that. You first get whichever practice or commercial practice to expand, and then the legislation kind of catches up. So in that case, it's kind of a consolidation. It can provide, but not necessarily drive the change in the first place. By definition, most institutions' power is limited in scope and space. There are kind of frozen solutions to specific problems. So whenever you want to expand trade, it often means you're going to have commercial exchanges occurring outside of the scope of these existing institutions. And usually institutions are limited. They also often kind of take time to act, and they are bounded geographically. So what I want to say is they're probably part of the story, but by no means all of it. Um, and now I'm going to move on to what I think kind of solved this problem and offered the possibility for culture to, and for trade and commercial exchanges to expand and scale up. And the proposition I have is mostly that some specific cultural practices kind of developed and scaffolded the expansion of commercial trade. And they kind of operate in two main ways, either by offering a woo, so either individuals or groups to trust, or by offering a what, so proxies or signals that you can trust instead of trusting the person you're going to exchange with. So depending on how I'm doing on time, we might not get into all of them, but that's roughly the kind of scope of those woo and what types of practices. And the idea is also that those kind of woo practices mainly act by realigning incentives. For some of them, they also have effects on how the information circulates and is actually ensured to be reliable. But a lot of those just really provide incentives for people to act in a way that is beneficial to expansion of trade. And on the other side, the kind of what to trust type of practices act by providing reliable signals of proxy that can be trusted instead of having to trust people. So now getting into the woo and kind of individuals part of it, the very first kind of increase in the number of agents involved in the economic activity is kind of from you to more than you, or from one family to kind of a bit bigger circle. And what's interesting is there's a pretty well-informed preferential use of kinship members when people try to expand on that kind of first step, their commercial activity. Um, and in the case where kinship members are actually not available, non-kin members can be still used in that same role economically, but they are also usually given fictional kinship. And that's the case in bazaars, inheritors, in some forms of apprenticeship and Japanese crafts. And what's interesting is it basically makes payoffs become interdependent, and you can then also recruit other social norms that are related to kinship. So in that case, you're kind of making the relationship a lot more long-term than it would be otherwise. But all that being said, it's a very limited way to expand your commercial activity, and it's not really going to be the kind of things that is going to scale up very well. Another thing that really helps is the emergence of middlemen. And what's interesting is that middlemen basically just alter social networks, and they reduce the number of links required in an economic network. So if you want to connect for buyers and for sellers all with each other, you can either have basically free links per individuals in this whole thing, or you can just use a middleman. In that case, every of those 8 agents just need one link to the middleman to access for potential economic partners. It's also interesting because it means kind of different distribution of links, whereas without middlemen, you get a kind of flat distribution with everyone having roughly the same number of links in the network, whereas you get those kind of middleman takes all distributions. And what's interesting is like middlemen are basically professionals of trust. So their work and the value of their work is really just keeping social relationships. They also centralize relationship, which is what we've seen before. And they can really act as being a trusted agent in a different physical location from the trade partner. And sometimes their economic value is also explicitly marked by letting them take a bit more than what was explicitly agreed to. So you also kind of get back some of those principal agent problems by using middlemen. But on the other side, because they are relatively central in economic networks, they're well placed to capture resources, and that will also create incentives on kind of a more evolutionary timescale for more people to actually become middlemen. Other kind of in the same line aspects are foreign traders. So foreign traders are usually the ones who historically were settling in a different place. So they become part of the social network locally while remaining part of also their kind of former, even now far away social network. And that might have been especially important because early on you need some kind of cultural mediator. So something akin to middleman, but that is a kind of specialist in creating links with a local population. So they have a pretty similar way to act as middlemen, but they're kind of more specialized on crossing cultural barriers, so to say. And trade diasporas are kind of an even bigger expansion of that. And they're also where this typology from Wutu trust focused on individuals kind of expands to Wutu trust based on groups. Because diasporas can exploit pre-existing social networks and basically just spread them over a different space. And among those ways to create kind of Wutu trust that scale up pretty well, there's ways to reuse ethnic and religious groups. So what's nice is those groups are kind of usually a form of bonus signaling because it's much more costly for outgroup members to produce signals of belonging to this group than for in-group members. And one thing that as a cognitive scientist I particularly like is also most of the cognitive machinery and processes you need to compute group belonging is probably in place before you get trait expansion. So you don't really require to bring in any kind of new cognitive processes for that. There's a lot of work about the theory of the ethnically homogeneous middleman. So a lot of middleman groups are ethnically homogeneous, and that can also provide a basis for group selection. And that's the case for diamond trade, Chinese merchants, James Marwari traders in India, Indian merchants in Central Africa and South Africa, Lebanese traders in West Africa, or Jewish merchants in medieval Europe or Tunisia. And kind of the last form of Wutu trust at group size is what I call institutionalized circles of exchanges. And it's also those kind of institutions that have been given a lot of weight in economic history. And I think what is really distinctive of them is they have three main characteristics. The first one is they have control over entry and inclusion in the exchange circle and who can exchange with who. They also have control over reputational information of people in the circle, and they have actually possibilities for punishment. Also, although it occurs mostly through ostracism or exclusion. And that's the case for champagne fairs, Maghrebi traders, diamond bourse arbitration boards, merchant guilds, and so on. So usually they are limited in scope, either in terms of which goods are exchanged or geographically. And again, they work really well, but for what works inside the institution. And the way they work is that business partners that are part of the institution can also reasonably be assumed to be reliable or good partners. So that's a way they kind of decrease this uncertainty about how the exchange partner is going to behave. Are they going to cheat me? Are they going to provide lesser quality goods? All that is kind of unlikely to happen if you are operating within one of those institutions. So now moving on to the kind of second big category of cultural practices, commodities have kind of three useful properties that we're going to talk through. And part of it is they're recognizable, which is usually done through the use of branding. They're protected, which is usually through sealing and packaging. And they're standardized, roughly. Actually, this is probably one of my favorite ethnographies ever. And it's a wonder. I really recommend reading it. So one way to sum all of this up is what happened in the 80s on the heroin trade scene in New York. So what happened is you used to have a monopolist. So basically, whenever you wanted to find a pretty high quality heroin, you would just ask for one of these guy. And that would be a pretty easy way to get high quality goods. With very low uncertainty about what would be the cost, or kind of, yeah, just that was a kind of good heuristic to conduct trade in that way. Unfortunately, this monopolist gets arrested. So what happens is you suddenly have a lot more differences in quality of heroin in general in the um, trade in New York City at that point. And one of the things is also, for a bunch of political reasons, that's the time at which cops and policemen are actually not patrolling the cities as much anymore. So what happens is you see this kind of stamps or brandings of heroin doses that appear, and they're called dope stamps. And one of the reasons they work well is also because in that case you can just ask whoever else is obviously an heroin consumer, what is the good one right now? So you have this kind of strong information backup to figure out who you should get your heroin from. And if anyone wants to know how the story ends, it actually ends up pretty much when policemen were allowed to get back in the street, because those things that were allowing consumers to track good quality products to traders also relates traders to their products, which is something that policemen could then use. So that's basically how it ended. Uh, but that's already like telling a lot about in which cases people would use branding and what for. And if you look at the history of branding, it has actually been practiced really for history and in a lot of different places. So, like, the idea with branding is that the mark that is put on goods is used as a signal of some qualities or characteristics of the goods, for instance, provenance, who produced it, and there are some circumstances it can also work as a good proxy for quality, and at least as a way to identify goods and link them to quality related information. And actually, for a good part of the history of trade, information on the provenance is a really good proxy for quality too. So then marking can also be used to signal property ownership, and then kind of has this second effect on participating in establishing property rights. And you can see the development of trademarks, including by guilds, and how they use specific characteristics of the products as a form of branding, as another form of honest signaling too. So now this kind of use of branding as something you can rely on to make your commercial exchanges depends on the frequency and quality of copycats and how difficult it is to copy the branding on trademarks, but also on the other side, how easy it is to match the reputation with the mark or sign. So those are going to be the kind of main parameters that matter in scaling up using this type of practice. And finally, the importance of branding also increases whenever the goods quality is more opaque, simply because you cannot get access to the goods quality information directly. So in that case, it gets more and more important to have a proxy for it. And kind of the extension of it is modern brands and chains. And it's kind of interesting because they also choose to have economic entities treated as agents, so attributed similar types of quality, including trustworthiness or expectations of reliability. And then they also create opportunities for longer term interactions. So they also act on this kind of temporal horizon problem we talked a bit earlier. And they also use on purpose kind of personal attributes. And there's actually a really good paper on how hotel chains are really exploiting this possibility for a longer commitment. So now another aspect is the kind of sealing and packaging. And what's really great with sealing and packaging is it's a pretty good way to ensure that the content has not been tampered with, or the quality hasn't been changed, or the quantity hasn't been changed, or that the quality has been verified, and that it hasn't been altered since. So That's actually what happened a lot in Victorian tea trade, where tea was exported to the UK in bulk, and then you had your local trusted English middleman who would do the packaging and certify of the quality of it. And as an also kind of side advantage, sealing and packaging have a logistic advantage. So the last aspect of commodities is they tend to be standardized, and standardization ensures consistency with regards to quality or quantity. Sometimes they can come from the production process itself. For instance, if you're using looms, usually you're going to put a thing of a given and fixed size. And in some cases, those kind of aspects of the production process being highly standardized were actually used as a form of branding. And that's especially the case in fabrics trade. So you have other examples that are just how measurement units spread, or how the Chicago Board of Trade actually fixed kind of standards for cereals varieties. And a good, like a major thing on which standardization depends is actually technical advancement, because before industrialization, consistency can be pretty hard to obtain. Another practice is simply the use of money, and I'm not going to say much about it because it's been talked about a lot, but roughly it increases comparability and simplifies transactions. And the scalability of money really depends on what the value of money is based on. So it's pretty high when it's based on intrinsic qualities of the money, so like weight and purity of the metal. But whenever it turns to being kind of fiduciary type of money, then depends on the reach of other institutions that back up the money, which is kind of both and good and bad news. So we're almost done with the kind of cultural practices. And record keeping has been argued to promote reciprocal behavior, reputation formation, maintenance, social norms and norm enforcement, as well as group identity and empathy. There's a bit of experimental evidence for how record keeping actually helps in economic gains. And historically, you also get this hypothesis that writing emerged for record keeping and exchanging goods. Uh, Here, really, the idea is just that record keeping is another form of kind of artifacts or signal you can use to trust instead of trusting a person. And one of the things is, in terms of how much it can scale up, it really depends on literacy. So finally, one last kind of signals or proxy that can be used is the certifications by authority. And there have been a number of signatures by our authority used to certify quality of documents or goods, and actually pretty much all around the world. So from Georgia to China, Japan, even a lot of Europe as well. There was at some point a label for the emperor courts in China as well, and there are more contemporary equivalents like quality labels or certifications. And usually this can scale up kind of by piggybacking on the authority that backs it up. So how established is the authority that backs it up, but also what is its recognized geographical scope. So that kind of concludes this part and all the kind of cultural practices I want to suggest actually offer the scaffold for the expansion of trade. And the last thing is just a few points for discussion. So including kind of predictions made by this account. So one first thing is that the kind of woo to trust practices act mostly by altering social networks and realigning incentives between agents. Some pre-existing social networks might also be easier to alter than others, and they will also explicitly aim to preserve some form of relationship templates, so actually create structures that allow for personal links to form or be maintained. Whereas on the other side, those kind of what to trust practices are they actually help scaling up trade by being oriented towards creating reliable signal. And that's a pretty different prediction than whether you are actually reducing the risks related to trade and trust. And another aspect of those what to trust practices is that they're scaled up by piggybacking on other practices in a lot of cases, including literacy or other institutions. And finally, those kind of who and what practices have been used together throughout history, but probably in different proportions in different places. And I have a bit of indirect evidence or support to offer, especially for the what to trust practices. And the idea that they're really aiming at maintaining reliable signals. So most early regulation or laws surrounding trademarks and branding actually focused on whether the product delivered was of the same quality as the imitated brand, and not at all on what could have been the financial prejudice to the imitated brand. So in that sense, they're really aiming at preserving the relationship between a signal and quality rather than anything else. And that's also reflected in a lot of contemporary views on counterfeiting, for instance. And usually it's actually condemned or frowned upon if the signal is kind of imitated too well. And in some cases, counterfeited goods are sometimes viewed as simply being of another quality, and it's the consumer's responsibility to not be too easy to trick. And finally, I think it was pretty obvious for the talk, but a lot of those things are either art to fake or on a signal, including ethnicity and some techniques that guilds actually used to mark their productions. So getting back to the big picture, we kind of filled this subset of problems related to trust by suggesting you're using both who and what to trust practices. And that's basically my take-home message. So the expansion of commercial exchanges was scaffolded by a set of cultural practices, which solve some of these problems of uncertainty and trust that branch out in either being by trusting who, which can be either individuals or groups, or by trusting what, which are usually proxies or signals. And what I'm also interested in is that a lot of these practices exploit cognitive mechanisms that were already in place before the expansion of trade. And their ability to expand trade depend on their own scalability and how they themselves can scale up. And that's pretty much. So thank you all for listening to me for that long, and I'm really welcoming any question.
Okay. All right, so questions, please just speak up. If it gets chaotic, I will step in, but I assume it won't. Questions?
Hi, thank you for the talk. I'd like you to, I didn't understand the point you briefly went over about group selection and ethnically homogeneous middlemen. Could you expand on that a little bit more?
Sure. So, I mean, to be fair, that's not one of my points. That's a point I'm borrowing from Janet Landa's work. So she suggests that because you get those ethnically homogeneous middle group, there's a bunch of their characteristics that really make them pretty good candidates for group selection, but more as a kind of evolutionary economics style of group selection. In the sense of
Group selection for what? Like sort of in what sense of group selection? What is being selected?
So as far as I understand what she did, both their behavior and like which things they kind of choose to signal and their economic activity, so what they choose to specialize in.
Okay, thanks.
Hi. Thanks for the talk. So it seems that early long distance trade, one of the problem that had to be solved was organizing and financing these trade expedition.
Yeah.
You know, you come up to me and you say, I have this great idea, I have a boat, I need some money, I'll be back in 2-3 years if all goes well. You know, and there's also then trust issues to solve, not between exchange partners, but among these this economic partnership. We're building contracts and such, and it really seems that these issues are solved by institutions. But I've just thought about cultural scaffolding, dealing with these issues. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so actually, that's pretty much why state companies, like nation state companies, had good success for a while, just because they at the sheer scale you needed to pull risks in the first place. So I would agree, but I think it's kind of really depending on which problems you want to solve. Because even to make it worth it to have a 2 or 3 years expedition and put those costs out, you need to know that trade is a possibility to go well in the first place. So I think I'm kind of interested in a problem that comes even before you get that.
Right. Thank you.
Can you talk just briefly about the difference between trade and consumption, especially in terms of issues of standardization and like branding? They seem to be, kind of in tension with one another, whereas to brand something is also to create some sort of inalienable uniqueness of an object that might involve trading, but then also involve people who are engaging in something. They're consuming the items that they're trading.
That is true, but I think you get a lot of the same problems whether you're trading things and consuming them, in the sense of you care about the quality of the goods you have in both cases. And you can be fooled or cheated on in pretty similar cases, whether you're actually consuming the good or just exchanging it. So I think, yeah.
I was thinking more of like sometimes with trade, the goal, especially in classical definitions of capitalist economies, for example, where you're using commodities to build wealth, that you can then use to finance for other things, which is a little different than somebody who might be going and comparing like a mass-produced, highly standardized good, and then see something that's branded in a particular way that might say, oh, this is actually, this is the nice salt. Let's buy this and take it home. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think I get what you mean. I'm just not sure. Do you mean at which level are you interested in the difference? Like at the psychological level or behavioral?
Oh, I don't know. I was thinking, I guess, in the political economic level. I don't know, in terms of what motivations things are, but just how these things operate in terms of where trust is going, in terms of one's motivation for something that they may need in their household or something like that, versus the motivations of someone who needs to have different kinds of trust in terms of being, an agent of a commercial enterprise.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really good point. I didn't really think a lot about it before, to be honest. Yeah, I would definitely need to think a bit more about it, to be honest.
Helena, one of the things you don't mention that seems to me to be a big impediment to trade is predation, basically, pirates and other. So if the scale of political institutions isn't big enough to suppress, sometimes this happens like in the Silk Road when the Mongols took over, trade flourished on the Silk Road because it was tougher to be a pirate than when there were a bunch of polities spread along the Silk Road. And then in many cases, when trade really scales up, the Venetians and various, in the Indian Ocean trade, the trading companies themselves became military organizations, which, later the British India Company, but before that, there were a whole series of kingdoms or trading entrepôts that extended their military power way out across the ocean just to suppress China's pirates, even Chung Ho's Indian Ocean things. But anyway, so it seems to me that one of the things that really enables long distance trade and the expansion of trade is the ability to suppress predation. And now, is that sort of out in your bigger picture circle or yeah?
So
Okay.
I would put it in the kind of middle circle of uncertainty. And that's really what I meant when I said you need secured roads. Because I think that's something that obviously impacts very strongly
Yeah.
whether you're going to be able to conduct trades, but it's not one of those things where they directly relate to the trust you have in your economic partners. And they're really interesting, but the thing is just I'm a cognitive scientist, so I'm more interested in how people interact with each other and what they believe. So I feel like I have a better account for how you solve those kind of trust problems.
Yeah.
But I mean, you're totally right in acknowledging how important those were.
Well, I'll ask something here. It looks like you're trying to explain the growth of trade in the early modern period. Yet almost all of the institutions and practices that you describe go back thousands of years and are found all over the world. So wouldn't the explanation for the growth of trade in the 16th, 17th centuries be a historical explanation?
I mean, so I think one of the things is I would tend to not really say there's one birth of trade, but just like successive and local expansions. And, you know, because of that, it's kind of no surprise you get the same set of practices recurring in different places in different times. Like, I think if anything, that's actually a pretty good argument saying those practices are actually necessary because they help scaffold the different expansions in different places and up to different scales. Like you get sealing and branding in the Mediterranean world much earlier than when it's reused for European trade.
Yeah, it just seems that listing all of these features, yeah, these things were involved, whether we're talking about Aztec Mexico or ancient China or Africa in the 12th century. The question is, how do you determine which of these were most important in a particular place at a particular time?
I honestly think that's kind of next step, because like this, I'm really trying to just wrap up this, but I really think about it as like kind of a first broad sketch thing. And I'm trying to get into what exactly it would predict and how we can test what and what are the available data sets for that next. So that, I mean, I totally agree. I think it's like the probably most exciting direction you can get to from here. Just
Well,
to
no,
go.
I think it's really interesting, and I like your list of all the traits and practices because it's broader than you get in your standard economic history work. And I'd be interested in I don't know, maybe seeing a list of all your things and thinking about how there could be operationalized archaeologically, because we can study some of these things, but not all of them in the archaeological record. And in archaeology, we lack good models to address these questions. And so anyway, I thought that was cool. So thank you.
Oh, thanks.
Great. Anything else?
Yeah, I got another question. I'm trying not to hog the floor here, but I'll do it anyway. So you didn't say very much about the processes that give rise to these cultural changes that potentiate trade. So Joan and I say in our house, we don't leap to conclusions, we leap to hypotheses. So here, it seems to me there's a stress in the account that I think you should think about. You probably have, known you, but which is some of the things you could think of as being ordinary adaptation at, in some sense, the individual or small group level. So, branding. If I'm a producer of something, and I want to have a long-term relationship with my consumers, I brand it. The consumers respond to that because if I'm not lying, it provides information about the quality of the goods, and the institution arises, other people copy us because we're doing better, etc. But a bunch of the things are, in some sense, group functional things, right? So the fact that somebody else can't come along and take my heroin stamp and put it on probably my guess is comes from the fact that if he does that, my guys go out and shoot him, right? But so that may be self-help, not group functional enforcement. But it seems to me a lot of the institutions that have arisen are partly technical things, insurance and various things like that. But partly they're ways of making the cultural practices more aimed at making the whole system function better, not each individual actor in the system better. So I wonder if you are going to press ahead and try to explain how that happens.
So actually, just for the heroin trade, they actually couldn't really protect their own trademarks, and they kept changing every few mornings. So it really depends on having another kind of circuit of information that is reliable.
Yeah. There's a lot of gossip amongst the users.
Yeah, so it's like you get high quality information, even if the signals are not stable.
Yeah.
I mean, I have to say that I think ultimately you're asking a question of what's the kind of most relevant scale to think about those. Is it like group or individuals? And I mean, I think you kind of get both, because like you can get it kind of advantages for one individual who innovates and gets those practices. But you also get more advantages once this practice exists to have it at a populational scale. Just because people have kind of, learning processes, and that becomes something they can use more efficiently. So yeah, I don't know. What are the possible answers you see to your questions, actually? You're muted.
I did that on purpose. Avner Greif has this story about, I'm sure you know, about the competition between the Javanese and Maghrebi traders in the Mediterranean in the late Renaissance, I think it is. Well, late Middle Ages and Renaissance period, and so within each of these groups, you could kind of see it. So the Maghrebi traders are resting on kin-based institutions or kin-based loyalties, and the Javanese had a more market-based system, and so they competed more or less on an even footing. And then, as the scale of trade increased, the kin-based system couldn't scale up as effectively. This is to make a book-length treatment, in 25 words or less. But and so eventually, for most of that scale trade. So I think of that as kind of a group selection process in which one self-sustaining set of cultural practices or institutions, whatever you want to call them, replaced another because the competition was really between institutions, not between individuals. Whereas other places, it's, a lot of the stuff you talked about, you could explain quite well, I think, on the goal-seeking individuals adopting practices that work for them, and then there's some kind of mutual interdependence, and the thing evolves to some structure that works. And so that's the kind of direction I was trying to push you in a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, I would really not disagree. I'm actually just wondering, in how many cases do you have kind of good enough historical cases to see how the competition occurred? And I think my main concern would be more, what's the information we have about those cases? But to be fair, I feel like it kind of, lines up with a lot of what I said, which is some of the practices scale up better than others. And for sure, cultural groups that are going to stick with practices that don't scale up are going to pay some kind of consequences for it.
I'll shut up.
I mean, I love your question, so I don't mind if you go on, but
Well, we can talk later.
John, you're muted.
Sorry. Okay. If there aren't any other questions, then I think we should let Helena go back to her life in figuring out the principles and how long distance trade evolved. So I hope we see you again in not too long, especially as we're all vaccinated and able to interact in person. So thank you very much for joining us today. And thanks everybody for coming.
Thank you.